What is this? What's going on here?
Silent Hill is a psychological horror adventure that really needs no introduction. It follows Harry Mason as he arrives in the town of Silent Hill after a car crash and finds his daughter Cheryl is missing. Atmosphere. From the minute the game begins, there's a strange, surreal feeling to the town, ashes falling from the sky and there's nobody around. The dreamlike feeling to the place continues, with the unnatural pace to some of the dialogue and people's attitudes sometimes make them seem like they're in a daze. The thick fog prevents you from seeing too far ahead, and the soundtrack plays low bitrate rumbles, making the place feel like a bad dream, until its nightmarish form rears its ugly head. Silent Hill's Otherworld is iconic and one of the most memorable locations in gaming history. Its blood and rust unpleasantness is even more vile here thanks to the blocky PlayStation 1 graphics. The limitations on the PlayStation make some things clear enough to be visually unpleasant, but still not detailed enough for you to know it's true horror. The Otherworld turns ordinary locations like the school or hospitals into twisted representations of themselves, with bodies strung up to the walls and metal grating replacing the floors. The doors and walls change locations, and it really feels like reality itself is being broken down as you hear something horrifying lurking around the corner. Silent Hill revels in its unpredictable weirdness, with strange events and sudden noises taking place with no explanation or even a reason for some things to happen at all, with the sound of children crying being heard in a random bathroom in the school at night and crashing noises coming out of nowhere in the hospital. It's deeply unnerving and sometimes even frightening because it's unclear what's happening. I still remember being disturbed by the sound of a bird fluttering in an obviously empty bird cage. But it subverts expectations a lot too by having a large build-up to nothing, which sometimes still sends a shiver down my spine. The bewildering nature of the town can inflict dread as you don't know what's coming up next, but there's always the radio static to let you know whatever is coming is something bad. The game also has strong religious tones, but is pointed towards something horrific. In an almost cosmic horror style, it feels like the town itself is a relentless, inescapable purgatory that teeters on the verge of insanity, with an unknown force turning its dials for the helpless protagonist of its game. Silent Hill's atmosphere, it was revolutionary for its time, and it still holds up today, somewhere between a strange dream and a horrible nightmare. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's scripted events from the alley sequence at the start of the game really set the tone. They're often perfectly timed, so you feel like you've walked straight into a trap. There's one or two jump scares, and they're usually done very well, from the winged creature bursting through the cafe window at the start of the game to the cat in the locker room. Despite being cutscenes, the game's atmosphere draws you in so much that it's still a shock. The monsters of the original game aren't full of deep symbolism or even particularly unique in appearance, but the way they act, from the hunched over nurses to the apes running around after you and pinning you to the ground, are just supremely creepy or disturbing. The winged enemies fly out the corner of the screen to kick you in the head, and the dogs chase you relentlessly, trying to bite you as you run away. The boss fights are even more horrifying, with the school basement boss opening its giant mouth to swallow you whole when you're sometimes too close to get away, and the appearance of the final boss in the good ending, which just looks like a mangled version of Satan. Whilst the enemies lunge out of the darkness to attack you and swarm you the second you enter a room, I found it was often things you couldn't see that were far more frightening. Sometimes the combat music would start playing in an empty room, and despite the fact that I could see no one was in there, it was unsettling enough to make me want to leave immediately. The game messes with the player a lot in the form of sudden unpredictable noises that made me stop in my tracks, to the subtle transitions to the Otherworld, like the clock tower in the alley. So much of the game scares verge on its atmosphere that it's often difficult to prize the two apart, with both feeding into each other. It's a perfect unison of atmosphere setting up creepy moments and enemy combat, which then increases the atmosphere and the circle continues. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The music in Silent Hill is as iconic as the game is itself, and it evokes a wide range of emotions. The game probably has the weirdest selection of pieces, with some tracks bordering on harsh noise with squealing high-pitched tones and thunderous drums, to deeply creepy tracks that sound like an awful dissonant rumble punctuated with whispery metal sonar-like blips. There's plenty of strange melodies and haunting tones, and I love the use of low bitrate rumbles that just sound so unnatural. Many of the tracks sound like they were made by someone with no idea how to play the instruments, but they still end up sounding like the most finely crafted creepy tracks imaginable, and some even verge on maddening with awkward repeating chords. The soundtrack is perfect for the game and transforms so many environments into something supernatural the second it starts playing. The combat doesn't come in often, but when it does, it's like chattering scissors or metal on metal, harsh, repeating rhythms and eerie organ synths like a machine gone wrong. The sound effects are all low quality, but with the amount of reverb the game uses, they sound haunting even from basic effects like opening doors to the grunts and whines of the enemies. Everything is loud but slightly muffled. The menu sounds are also all vaguely haunting, which I really like. The voice acting is strange, to say the least. It's much clearer than the rest of the audio in the game besides the soundtrack, which makes it stand out. And whilst most lines are delivered okay, some feel deliberately off and many come too late with awkward pauses. As mentioned earlier, it's kind of dreamlike in presentation. The directional audio is functional, but a bit hit and miss, except for the radio, which was always perfect. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. The gore in Silent Hill feels either senseless or symbolic, from the dog's head on the floor next to the blood-stained basketball hoop to the strung-up bodies in the school. It's disturbing, and the more you think about how the gore came to be, the less you'll like the answers. The combat is gory too, with blood spurting out of enemies with every gunshot and melee impact. It covers a lot of things you interact with, and often seems to be in places it shouldn't be, which again feeds into the town's weirdness, with Viscera laying in the street with no explanation at all. Silent Hill will probably be okay without its gore, but like everything else in the game, it's finely crafted and deliberately done to perfection. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. Harry Mason arrives in Silent Hill after a car accident brings him and his daughter Cheryl off the road. Upon awakening, she disappears into the fog and Harry pursues after her. The game introduces a lot of things and many characters speak in riddles or seem unrelated, but all have their own connection to the events or secret agenda. There are a lot of things at play and a great deal of it seems cryptic. The characters you speak to the most, like Sybil and Lisa, don't know what's going on either, and a large portion of the story and possible ending is locked off if you don't explore the environment, with some areas in the game that don't seem important containing little bits of story like the diary entries at the police station. Its plot is pretty confusing, but many of its themes are reasonably recognizable, from the cult trying to bring about their gods and the purification of the earth they also want to invoke, which is implied to be a nightmare beyond imagination. It often feels a bit overwhelming, and with most of the characters not understanding the story themselves, it doesn't help the player grasp it that well either. What saves it is the town changing for the worse more and more, which gives it a feeling of progression even if the story doesn't feel like it's going anywhere sometimes. Ultimately, it's down to how well you explore and how you grasp it. Some people may leave feeling they didn't understand it at all, and some may finally understand its dark and morbid tale of religious corruption, making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. Silent Hill is a classic. Its age hasn't stopped it, and with each passing year, its graphics become more creepy and dated in the best way possible. Its atmosphere is unbeatable, and its unsettling story and frightening enemy encounters cement it as one of the best in the genre. There would be a significantly smaller number of great horror games if there was no Silent Hill to pave the way. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion of horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst it all began with Harry Mason, I did not scream like a banshee or run over the computer, and I advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.